The Disappearing L, Erasure of Lesbian Spaces and Culture by Bonnie J. Morris. Chapter 5. Points of Erasure. Remembering Generation Flannel. Quote, typical wave models of feminism, which describe feminist movements as succeeding each other temporarily in a linear historical progression, and tend to posit strictly defined generations of women as irrevocably at odds with each other's interests, are inadequate. Feminist waves might better be conceived of as interacting sound waves. Sounds can be thought of as a pressure and movements doing cultural work. End quote. Tara Rogers, Pink Noises. Quote, in 1970, there were, of course, no public venues for reading lesbian poetry, or doing anything else, to a woman's audience yet. I took my shirt off at one point to display the nakedness one needs to tell new truths, and then I set fire to my poems, in memory of Sappho and the historic burning of her work. End quote. Judy Gran, A Simple Revolution. Quote, the cultural erasure is everywhere. It's time for lesbian feminists to be more vocal about our existence. Our future is imminently tied to that of gay men, bisexuals, and transgendered people, but most importantly, it is tied to our struggle as women. End quote. Urvashi Vaid, Calling All Lesbians. Quote, in my research, I realized over and over again that women's achievements had been left out of history and the records of their lives had apparently disappeared. End quote. Judy Chicago, The Dinner Party. Right now, many female activists in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s are gazing thoughtfully into the glowing embers of lesbian culture. For us, this is still an active campfire where we gather and warm ourselves, one which we hope will not fade away into forgotten ash, but instead retain hot coals to stoke new fires. Such images of heat and spark have always served to symbolize shifts in leadership. Think of that other fire-based metaphor, the passing of the torch, presumably to a next generation. What does it mean if that next generation is disdainful of the torch, welcoming its dousing, or lacks the data or the will to learn how it was lit and carried forward in the first place? What parallels can be drawn between the dismissal of lesbian culture by present-day gender activists and the fading of other women's movements in history? Are these cycles of disappearance inevitable, even predictable? For lesbians, current reasons for cultural erasure include a potent mix of conventional sexism, cycles of conflict where women are set up to attack one another, and the old horizontal hostility within minority culture, lack of representation in history institutions such as museums, and the mainstreaming of the LGBT movement. Each of these four challenges helps disappear the achievements of a still living generation. Activists who are engaged in this question of cultural extinction are taking steps to archive the entire creative corpus of lesbian art and music from the performance networks of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. In referencing these debates and dialogues, I've drawn upon sources, including the 2013 Old Lesbian Oral History Project Conference, panels by members of the Committee on Lesbian and Gay History at the 2014 American Historical Association annual meeting, panels on lesbian history at the 2014 Berkshire Women's History Conference, and multi-generational dialogue sponsored by Sister Space Pocona Weekend at the University of Pennsylvania in spring 2008. Alexis Clements' Unknown Play Project, which addresses the vanishing of lesbian spaces. A 2-day lesbian publishing salon convened by Julie Esner at the DC LGBT Center in January 2014. Presentations by Eric Fauner and Mary Corey at the College Board's AP U.S. History Reading in June 2014. Presentations at the Washington, D.C. Jewish Community Center concerning lapses in the film The Monuments Men. Letters printed in Lesbian Connection and the Canadian-based journal Trivia's two huge issues in 2010, both devoted to the question, are lesbians going extinct? The common thread of frustration expressed by participants in all of these discussions is that lesbians are neither visible nor appreciated for what they have given to their movement, their communities, and, in many instances, their country. Being misrepresented in historical record, or left out of it altogether, is especially hurtful to women looking back at lives entirely spent on activism, women whose choices did not cushion their elder years materially. Having given decades to the gay and lesbian movement, most lesbian activists over age 40 have lived to see astounding gains: same sex marriage, other legal protections, openly LGBT politicians and athletes, football players yet. However, there's an almost universal agreement that lesbians' efforts to get here and the successful slash women identified cultural institutions that lesbians constructed for their own communities, having been shut out of both mainstream and gay male institutions, aren't included in the 21st century's version of LGBT history. Quote, I gave my prime to radical lesbian activism, and I have boxes in the basement with negatives that document those times. I am just one of many obscure and unknown contributors to the development of a women's culture and the lesbian culture that sparked into action during the 1970s and 80s. But radical lesbian activism does not come with a pension plan or health benefits. There are unknown heroes out there who put aside their career and separated from their families in order to do activist work, dedicating their lives to social change. I suspect they have no pension plans either, and they're wondering what happened to the investments they made of their lifeblood and energy so that we could have gay marriage today. For every Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich that we can name, there were equally brilliant and active women who did their work without a spotlight. Those women are the heroes. Is our famous lesbian culture one which, in a dominant culture, casts aside our numbers who are not useful to us anymore? I just came back from a workshop with Rhiannon. Seeing her took me back to the days of feminism and women's music. I have been feeling sad and depressed lately. Like women, the woman spirit has disappeared. The rapes, the kidnapping of the young girls who were getting an education, the sex trafficking, where did all that power and energy go? How do you deal with the loss of that time of deep connection to women's power and joy? We sometimes joke about being dinosaurs, or we ruminate about shakers and wonder if we too a utopian community that will eventually die out for lack of heirs. We are lesbians who went back to the land around 30 years ago, and, despite our relative invisibility to those who chronicled recent feminist history, some of us are still here. But these days, lesbian lands seems to be a well kept secret. Many young dykes are astonished to learn that women's lands exist, and are sometimes hardly able to fathom the concept, attached as they are to a queer self definition, more self aware as sexually deviant than woman identified. We have been lampooned as dogmatic, as humorless fanatics, as earth muffins and bliss bunnies. I jumped and hollered for joy when Diana Nyad arrived in Key West. Why did Diana's victory fail to excite and strike a passionate response in the lesbian community to this heroic athlete and her unique world record? Perhaps the mass media's routine refusal to cover most actual women's news, including news about an old woman athlete, except to report on the jealous male athletes who tried to accuse her of cheating, explains some of the silence slash indifference in our women's communities. Every movement needs radical fringes to propel it, to make the center seem palatable to status quo consciousness. We see this on the right as well as on the left. But as new generations come up, old and young radicals necessarily battle for space, language, definition. The 2009 catalog for Frameline, San Francisco's LGBT film festival, contained a description about a documentary on the lesbian singer Farron that includes the line, quote, "It's a rare chance to encounter a voice from the past," end quote. A voice from the past, a rare encounter. What a kick in the head to all of us who thought we were still living in the present. We are disappearing into the normalcy of the nuclear family and losing identity as a people. Every woman is her own official authority. What lesbians have done for all women is to open the door for all generations, and the development is uneven. The issues haven't changed, but how we talk about them has. And a lot of that has to do with women getting sober. Lesbians are not equal beneficiaries of the recent increased tolerance for LGBT and women's history. I recently submitted a women's history manuscript and was asked, "But are you going to include men?" As we anticipate SCOTUS's decision on same sex marriage, and the Seven Sisters begin to welcome students born into male bodies, as well as their trans male students, I think we are in a really incredible moment that could go either way. Our feminism told us that gender should not be an obstacle. Lesbians were not lacking in any skills, least of all in bed. We could do everything, perform every role. Our lived experiences taught us otherwise. There are still an impenetrable old boys club, and our gendered bodies define us as unimportant outsiders. Even in our lesbian/gay cultures, the dual queering and assimilation of the past 2 decades has been a very patriarchal creep, erasing and minimizing the two women together image that I love in favor of an alphabet soup community skewing male. And it seems that many of today's young andro/butch, what we used to call affectionately dyke, women are reimagining their tomboy childhoods and creating meta stories to explain transitions. And I feel old. I want lesbian back. I am scared to see our history erased. Back in the day, we were invisible, and we needed to gather in places like Michigan to listen to our music, read our books, and publish our magazines, like Lesbian Connections, in order to satisfy a deep existential need to be with our own kind. I propose we were successful. We are no longer invisible like we once were, and we've created a world where younger women no longer need to do those things. There is widespread erasure of lesbians because the world has moved on, not because of some patriarchal conspiracy. End quote. In view of the increasing mainstream attention to LGBT history, even its commodification as queer tourism in places such as San Francisco, which scholar Nan Boyd calls, quote, historical memory as a point of purchase, end quote, why has recent lesbian culture been so uniquely devalued? Most answers return to us. Uh, Most answers return us to the familiar demon of sexism, the almost casual discounting of what individual women or women as a group achieve. Sexism. In LGBT magazine's 20th anniversary issue, in which every article was written by and about women, with no content by or about men, might be considered deliberately male excluding or perhaps be subtitled The Women's Issue, acknowledging clear one sidedness. An anniversary issue of gay and lesbian writing, written almost entirely by men, is still an uncontroversial anniversary issue. Likewise, the cover story of the Sunday, October 5th Washington Post magazine announced The Gay Moment, How We Got to a New American Reality, with an illustration of two grooms ascending a wedding cake. Inside, the story profiled three white male leaders, no lesbians introduced or referenced by the female, in this case, journalist. Is the gay moment not meant to include gay women after all? Out editor Aaron Hicklin seemed sympathetic to lesbians boycotted in cyberspace, suggesting in his own editorials that the LGBT community now overreacted, quote, to anything that falls foul of approved policy. I can't help feeling that our growing hysteria, the cry of the mob, is the sound of the formerly powerless fetishizing their victimhood, end quote. Yet the same 89-page issue of Out contained exactly one image of a lesbian couple, in an ad for Tylenol. Representation is sorely lacking in our media. Reviewing the new LGBT history textbook, Linda Hirschman's Victory, The Triumphant Gay Revolution, critic Nikolai Andres charged, quote, lesbians are clearly underrepresented, which the book's subtitle suggests, once again, gay, here means a primarily white, predominantly male-focused, economically privileged, liberal-leaning tale that is very cohesive and grandiose, but it seems to discount the subtleties of race, class, and gender, end quote. Whether as wives or in the workforce, American women who give their all and expect some sort of reward or recognition too often end up being replaced by the next, younger body. Several women I spoke with suggested that in America's LGBT movement, lesbians have indeed been replaced by newer and more interesting bodies, trans women. In the realm of social media and political rhetoric, lesbians and trans women were cruelly set against one another in the ongoing battle over Michigan Women's Music Festival. This has successfully rewritten recent history to portray lesbian cultural activists as both privileged and oppressive, burying other realities. In the introduction chapter, where I pondered the absence of I am a lesbian signs at an LGBT student union, I concluded that the old man-hating label still offers an excuse to push lesbians aside. The thriving women-only culture of the 1970s and 80s and onward was certainly informed in no small way by the philosophy and stance of lesbian separatists, as well as lesbian feminists, two groups not invested in pleasing men or conceding to male leadership. This made working for the male heads of gay organizations and cheerfully collapsing everything female into queer unlikely to be ideal for lesbians as strategists. Lesbian separatism distanced straight men, women married to men, and gay men. And in these three groups, we find most of the people who write history books, write for television, and otherwise reproduce images. Today, man-hating has been replaced by the label of transphobia or TERF as a means to discredit lesbians and or deny a platform for articulating lived lesbian experiences. Where LGBT gains have not specifically been lesbian gains, lesbians are still not permitted the self-authorization to gain or speak as the L without appearing isolationist or anti-GBT. When sources such as the Transgender Studies Quarterly suggest that cisgenderism is an unlearnable bias and indeed a pathology, the self-identification of cisgender lesbians becomes an oppressive act. When applied retroactively to some of the 1970s culture, with a diagnosis disempower such a diagnosis disempowers lesbian separatists as risk-taking innovators and replaces old labels of psychological illness with new ones. Whatever was once radical is now heretical. However, gay men are still granted more latitude than lesbians for stances conflicting with present ideals of the trans movement. Writing in Changing the T for LGBs in the August/September 2015 Advocate, author Dana Beyer rebuked Lisa Vogel, the producer of the Michigan Festival. Quote, "Unfortunately, rather than going out on the right side of history, Vogel has remained defiant until the end. Surviving intact as a separatist movement will be a Pyrrhic victory, and the demise of the festival, along with the increasingly public recognition by prominent national cisgender lesbians that trans women are women, is another signal that lesbian society is growing in its understanding of the meaning of gender identity." End quote. In contrast, 3 paragraphs later, Beyer wrote forgivingly of activist Jim Forat, who had also long defended lesbian separatists. Quote, "As is often the case, my in-person experience of the man was nothing like the caricature that had been built up in my mind over the years by rumor and innuendo. I wasn't interested in refighting old battles or determining the truth of what was said or wasn't said. We listened to each other, and I came away with an understanding of his concerns as a feminine gay man. Where we differ is on the spectrum of gender expression. We agreed on the need for mutual respect from both sides." End quote. 2 standoffs, but the second one softened by mutual respect instead of furthering hurtful innuendo. The only difference is that Lisa Vogel is a lesbian and Forat a gay male. Sexism has other faces. When lesbians speak as women, for instance, as advocates for abortion rights, their issues do diverge from those of gay men, a point explored by Jay Michelson's summer 2014 article, 10 Reasons Women Are Losing While Gays Keep Winning. Michelson's chilling analysis pointed to the many victories for same-sex marriage and gay military service in an era when, quote, "In the same 10 years, women's autonomy to make their own healthcare decisions has been steadily eroded. It hasn't been this hard to get an abortion in 40 years." End quote. He adds, quote, "In the 1970s and 80s, gay liberation was all about the liberation of sexual choice. Homosexuality was as much an act as an identity, as it still is today in some quarters of the Christian right. Only in the 1990s did the mainstream LGBT movement, to the continuing consternation of radicals, start saying that gays are born that way, i.e., that sexual identity was a fundamental, ultimately unchangeable trait. Abortion and contraception, however, are acts, and the pro-choice activists have repeatedly failed to reframe them as issues of discrimination against women." End quote. Even in an important discussion framing the acceleration of gay rights against the erosion of women's rights, however, the lesbian who occupies both spaces is not visible. Gay rights are equated with victories achieved by and for gay men. This is more than a question of semantics. Black women also disappear in the phrasing women and minorities. Lesbian leadership may be attributed to a vacuum left by male absences rather than female initiative or talent. Writing about the 1990s, Andrew Sullivan suggested, quote, "Most of the older male generation was dead or exhausted, and so it was only natural, perhaps, that the next generation of leaders tended to be lesbians, running the major gay political groups and magazines." End quote. There are, though, gay male leaders who demand accountability on women's rights, especially from conservative gay men recently elected to political office. Matthew Breen, editor in chief of The Advocate, started on the December 2013 January 2014 issue that an editorial of rebuke concerning anti feminist votes by LGBT caucus's members. Quote, how do any of these votes represent justice for lesbians who are among the lowest paid segment of the workforce? End quote. Sadly, the more that lesbians insist on an issue driven identity of their own as women, or claim spaces of their own to address those issues, the more their essentialism is perceived as transphobia. In Shira Tarrant's volume, Men and Feminism, ostensibly an invitation for males to be more involved as advocates for women's issues, a sidebar warns, quote, single-sex groups can support women in exploring anger. At the same time, single-sex groups are exclusionary. Such exclusion has been the source of ongoing controversy at the Michigan Women's Music Festival, where a women-born women-only policy means that trans women who were born male are denied entry, end quote. It cannot be repeated often enough that no individual was ever denied entry to the festival. But the more this myth circulates, the less interest there is in preserving festival culture as worthy of remembering for posterity. The focus on lesbian infighting and controversy is in itself a form of sexism, as if lesbians have produced nothing other than mean girl behavior in 40 years of cultural work. Like any oppressed group trying to figure out how to survive and advance, lesbians in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s disagreed with, split off from, and attacked one another. But it was primarily in their own media, before social media opened such conflict to the straight world for wry judgment. Still, even those debates must be studied and preserved as a significant part of the LGBT's history path to victory. The first reading I was handed in graduate school was E. H. Carr's What is History, which points out that no grand diplomatic document ever made it into print without not so diplomatic debates behind the scenes. While critics love to mock the amount of time lesbians spend processing, the result of all those community discussions did in fact produce effective structures for women's own concert production, festivals, publishing, and so on. What we are seeing now is an escalation of misunderstanding between the generations, primarily as younger lesbians prefer to identify as queer or dismiss women identification as a reinforcement of limited gender binaries. This adds to pre existing criticisms of lesbian feminism that came from within the community itself. Cycles of conflict. Women against women. From the sex debates of the 1980s, which cast all lesbian feminists as anti-sex prudes after some opposed pornography and sadomasochism, to the first protests against festivals, lesbian culture has been unique in being jeered from within its own intelligentsia, while also being attacked by straight progressives on the left and by conservative evangelical activists on the powerful right. There are plenty of other community movements with similar legacies of insider factionalism and outsider threats. Union organizing, socialism, the progressive Jewish peace movement, the Black Power movement. But mockery of lesbian wars is uniquely anti feminist in its judgment that even women who dig women just can't get along. There is an essential misogyny in preserving more of a paper trail on the infighting ascribed to our own leadership than evidence of community achievement in the era of brutal homophobic persecution. Both personal memoir and mainstream journalism portray the lesbian community as a site of humorless, punitive correctness. Quote, I know I wasn't the only lesbian feminist from whom the acrid factionalism of those years, the merciless intrusions of ideology into every crevice of fantasy and affect, exacted too great a price. The quest for innocent power and moral purity was in the end as problematic when pursued by lesbians as any 19th century cult of true womanhood. The Women's Peace Encampment in Seneca, New York, a lineal descent of the Women's Pentagon Action, became the site of epic struggles over principles and tactics. Every time I heard the latest from up there, or read about the annual Michigan Women's Music Festival, I felt mightily relieved to have missed the action. Thank God, I like to say. Feminists don't have state power. We'd be putting sisters up against the wall. End quote. Clausen's passive verbs heard about, read about, missed the action indicate her absence from these latter events. At a certain point, she withdrew from the lesbian community. This assessment, without eyewitness participation, continues to characterize many online attacks on the lesbian culture. But another means of devaluing the work of lesbians, who in a huge numbers helped to institutionalize women's studies programs, is the trend of asking whether women's history is still a meaningful field. One dedicated professor, whose academic work illuminated centuries of lesbian lives, was made to apologize for her choice of subject matter and for the presumed scholarly dyke nerd factor during a 2010 New York Times Magazine interview. What should have been an introduction to an important woman turned into a slam on earlier lesbians' contributions to history. Old stereotypes that lesbian scholars are narrow, stodgy, and stylistically impaired emerged in Deborah Solomon's interview with lesbian scholar Terry Castle, and it's a useful example of how the mainstream press plays a key role in perpetuating negative images. Interviewer Deborah Solomon. Your best known book, The Literature of Lesbianism, is a thick anthology that looks at female homosexuality in the works of writers as diverse as Hemingway and the Italian Renaissance. Why would you want to view literature through such a narrow lens? Castle. Female characters falling in love with one another is more pervasive than most people realize. Just about every major writer takes it up as a topic, starting with Shakespeare, with his cross-dressing women who flirt and beguile one another. Solomon. Camille Paglia has written that gay men are much livelier company than lesbians, whom she associates with resentment or ideology. Do you agree that lesbians suffer from a paucity of wit? Castle. Well, those who drank the Kool-Aid in the 1970s in the heyday of lesbian separatism, a lot of them have ended up in the academic world as historians or sociologists. And so there is a kind of earnest and stylistically impaired lesbian who is still in existence, like a stegosaurus. To her credit, Terry Castle goes on to add, quote, Gertrude Stein was hilariously funny. claims about the dourness of lesbianism have been overstated. End quote. Yet the reader, unacquainted with what lesbians have contributed to 20th century American culture, is unlikely to be left with a positive image of the impugned Stegosaurus, who could very well be her or his own professor, alive and kicking and writing and publishing, if stylistically impaired. Moreover, Castle herself cites the politics of the 1970s lesbian feminism as belonging to those who drank the Kool Aid, a reference to cult leader Jim Jones, who famously incited his followers to commit mass suicide. In this way, lesbian thinkers, many of whom, like Castle herself, contributed incalculable original scholarship to academia, can be characterized as the dredges of a mindless cult that came and went. And interviewer Deborah Solomon seems all too willing to complain that Castle's own contribution to historic research relies on such a narrow lens. You, she asks the lesbian professor, who has generously granted her some personal interview time, why study lesbians at all? A journalist might not interrogate an award winning black intellectual on the same level. One hopes that no one at the New York Times would tell Colonel West in an interview that his important work tracing black heritage relies on a narrow perspective. Women, straight, bi, trans, and lesbian, too, play unique roles in furthering the extinction and erasure of recent lesbian culture. No book better illustrates this process than Jill Gardner's From the Closet to the Screen: Women at the Gateways Club, 1945 to 1985. Gardner offers a complete history of the popular butch femme bar Gateways in Chelsea, London. The club's notoriety grew after its cameo appearance on screen in the 1968 film The Killing of Sister George, one of the first mainstream movies to depict lesbian nightlife in an authentic environment. Although a home to working class couples for decades and a refuge from homophobia, male violence, joblessness, family rejection, and street crime, the Gateways was ultimately defeated not by government intrusion or male marauders, but by other younger lesbians who objected to its patrons' traditional role playing. By the 1970s, the new generation of liberation activists were parting ways with the club's coat and tie culture of male identified butches and their dolled up femme companions. Because the bar's clientele seemed to reproduce a heterosexist model of coupling, disinterested in analyzing their own oppression and just out for a good time, the Gateways was subjected to a political zap action in 1970 and 1971. Women from London's Gay Liberation Front, in the spirit of the recent Stonewall riots in New York, urged the bar patrons to come out into the light and stop hiding. They met with resistance. Quote, I wasn't in sympathy with political campaigns by gays. Yes, I'd had a jolly hard time, and so had many others. But we had gained a great deal only by being who we were and behaving in the way that we did. I'd never had to wave a banner in my life. Gay liberation was a middle class thing. End quote. After several demonstrations for lesbian liberation outside the club, protesters finally entered one night and attempted to hand out leaflets. challenged by the bar's formidable security guard, Smithy, who roared, "I am a bigger lesbian than either of you will ever be." One woman from the GLF then pulled the plug out of the jukebox, silencing the music. This one scene tells us more than we want to know about the cycle of history. It marked a theoretical splitting over when it was meant to be a theoretical splitting over what it meant to be a gay woman, not just in England, but certainly in the United States. Judy Gran recalls, quote, "In our 1970 GWL movement, those of us who had come out in earlier times, or who felt we were born that way, were called bar dykes or old world dykes by younger women who had another perspective, who thought that becoming a lesbian was a personal political choice. The choice, they said, was to be free from male domination." End quote. Inevitably, the Gateways shut down, although it held onto its bar license until 1985. It was not until several years later that culturally active lesbians and academics in both the UK and the US began to re examine and properly inscribe butch femme bars and rules as a significant part of lesbian resistance. Today, many women long to have a space like Gateways again, or to hear the stories of its one time patrons. But like Sappho's fragmented poems, what was destroyed cannot always be put back together for the next generation to examine and learn from. When Alex Dobkin was first boycotted and banned from the Philadelphia Dyke March in 1998, Karen Otter Eskovitz wrote a letter to the march organizers linking these historical lessons. Quote, "In the 1970s, lesbian feminism took off, and all of a sudden the old school butches and femmes seemed old fashioned. The new generation couldn't understand why they would want to take on those silly societally enforced gender roles and live their lives closeted and passing. The new generation could not understand their struggles, the doors the older dykes had opened, the way their struggles were connected. The old school dykes were ridiculed and marginalized, excluded and shamed, and it was wrong. The political fads of the day, the party lines, kept those feminists from really understanding their own history and created deep divisions that have taken decades to repair. I sincerely hope that you will not repeat the mistake of our disassociating yourselves from your own history. You may not understand or agree with Alex's argument for women only spaces any more than the 1970s dykes understood or agreed with old school butch femme, but you can take advantage of the lesson we learned the hard way and not repeat the same mistake." End quote. Museums and historical narratives disappear the lesbians. In my Women's History Survey course, I routinely ask newly arrived college students tough questions. Just who creates the disappearance of a group of women from the annals of history? How did female composers and artists of the Renaissance vanish from record? Were the radical, empowered, scholarly nuns of the High Middle Ages wiped from the record by vindictive Protestants? More recently, how and why did Americans lose track of and forget about the players of World War II's All American Girls Baseball League or the Women's Air Service pilots? These aren't just lines from the midterm exam. As noted in Chapter 1, in too many cases, museum retrospectives disappear the contributions of women or ignore the contributions and particular experiences of lesbians altogether. A focus on ethnicity seems to disappear gender, as if two identities cannot coexist in what we now call intersectionality. After visiting the newly established U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, feminist critic Andrea Dworkin observed, quote, I was given research material that demonstrated the museum's commitment to documenting the egregious persecution of homosexuals. Included were biographies of 8 gay men and 1 lesbian. The museum's first conference, held in December 1993 on the known, the unknown, the disputed, and the re examined, eliminated women altogether by disappearing the 1 lesbian. There were talks at the conference on Nazi anti homosexual policies and their consequences for homosexual men, and the Pink Triangle, homosexuals as enemies of the state. There was scholarship on the Black experience in the Holocaust period, but nothing on women. How can this museum, dedicated to memory, forget to say what happened to Jewish women? If this genocide was unique, then what happened to Jewish women was unique. Attention must be paid, if not here, where? End quote. A review of the U.S. Holocaust Museum's traveling exhibition, Nazi Persecution of Homosexuals, 1933 to 1945, in The Advocate, acknowledges that the vast majority of those sent to concentration camps for homosexuality were gay men. But there is no attempt to include lesbians or to begin with a disclaimer that in this instance, homosexuality is solely inclusive of the male experience in a historic catastrophe. Similarly, the Washington, D.C. Museum's 2014 special exhibit, One Nation for All, promised an overview of newspapers produced by minority communities. In the small display on the gay press, there was no references to lesbians, nor were any lesbians identified as such in the Women's History Press exhibit. The single mention of lesbians in the exhibit appeared in a Filipino community newspaper's announcement of a same-sex wedding. There was more coverage of White House dogs at the museum than of women's roles in the LGBT movement. Even the limited imagery Dworkin found at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is too much representation of womanhood for some male leaders in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. Eli Kleinman, a businessman and the son of a Holocaust survivor, is bankrolling a separate Holocaust museum. The Kleinman Family Holocaust Education Center in Borough Park will be just for Orthodox visitors who might be offended by images of modern women or women dressed immodestly as victims or as resistance fighters/survivors. Rabbi David Riedel said that, quote, museum staff are still grappling with how to display women in the Holocaust without upsetting religious sensibilities. Asked how the museum could depict women's stories without offending ultra-Orthodox men, Riedel said that on days when ultra-Orthodox school groups visited the museum, they might have to make sure that no images of women are on display, end quote. For gay men, the exclusion of women from an archive may not be a question of religious sensibilities, but of unconscious sexism, simply not seeing women as athletes. Scholar Edward Madden noted that Ireland's queer archives fail to include any material from the dozens of lesbian sports leagues across Ire. The female local may be neglected for the civil rights national, but sometimes the masculine political power within archival and museum institutions, including those representing the LGBT experience, balks at inscribing lesbian social groups as historically meaningful. Museums are not necessarily the answer to lesbian invisibility. In fact, the proliferation of small and large LGBT archives is splitting up many collections, which, if less scattered, would offer stronger portraits of communities. A critique of the failed Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. warns that, quote, the proliferation of multiple institutions, public as well as private, needlessly limits needlessly splits audiences and drains resources. We have oversaturated the sustainable market by competitive ego, possessiveness, and jealousies. End quote. Moreover, putting images of lesbians in museums for future visitors is a tricky prospect. In the PBS documentary Playing for the World, the 1904 Fort Shaw Indian Boarding School girls basketball team, produced by John Triggs for KUFM TV at the University of Montana in 2009, several Native American women reflect on the sentimental and stereotyped images of indigenous quote unquote squaws displayed in museums. One concluded, quote, the oppressors, the colonizers, miss what they've killed, end quote. She recalls the bizarre preference of carnival and sideshow promoters at the end of the 19th century to put Indians and Africans on display in traditional dress, and similar exhibits were part of the Bronx Zoo and the St. Louis World's Fair. In the same film, which includes rare footage of Native American girls being displayed at the World's Fair in stalls, where white visitors could observe them sewing and ironing modern clothes, another narrator jokes that many whites won't believe he is an authentic Indian unless he is wearing a full war bonnet. This tension between a hegemonic culture's nostalgia for what it helps drive out and its insistence on pointing to one image as the authentic emblem of that vanished minority could speak to Jewish and lesbian history as well as the museumification of Native American tribal history. The lesbian is not merely becoming extinct, she is already the dinosaur, an unlovely animal that inspired fear and had to evolve out of existence to make way. We are tasked with constructing our own lesbian mythology for future archaeologists. Out of the humor and candor of those who lived on their own terms. Finally, it must be asked, do lesbians value lesbian culture and history? In quite a few cases, lesbian businesses, bookstores, presses, and festivals went under when lesbian consumers stopped supporting them, not deliberately or vindictively, but in significant enough numbers to break the bank. This exodus felt keenly disloyal to those who had provided for years uniquely lesbian services or environments that lifted the spirits of an oppressed community. As lesbians gained rights and more opportunities opened up for them in the mainstream, a combination of factors led to the exodus from festivals and bookstores. Bookstores of all kinds were affected by the shift to reading on screen, digital media, and mobile devices, including Kindle. Festivals were affected by some women's growing resistance to paying for a vacation that lacked hotel amenities yet dared to require a work shift. Longtime Campfest producer Lee Glanton addressed every one of these conditions, challenging her shrinking audience to save lesbian culture in her farewell address on Memorial Day weekend of 1999. Quote, "My sense of commitment to lesbian women was birthed in the 1970s at the Now Conference in Brooklyn, when I was first in the company of a large number of dedicated women. It was transformative magic, and the Brooklyn women, who have certainly been good to Campfest all these years. The Lesbian Feminist Conference that was held at Hunter College deepened the connection and provided a political framework for me. Never again was lesbianism what you did in the dark with a woman after too many drinks. It was, for me, forevermore belonging to a tribe. My concept of tribe has driven me for the last 20 years of my life. And when I say driven, I also want to say that it has been a teacher and a lover. Tribe has been rewarding, warm, funny, intimate, boring, hateful. It's all the things that we feel. I have a love affair with you. I adore all of you. Most of you, I don't even know your names. Don't know anything about you, really. I have a collection of names without faces. And I come to festival and I have faces without names. But I love you. I have spent these years trying to maintain this relationship, this commitment to you, the tribe I belong to through festival. And I envision that commitment as joining together with all these women you see here, indicating the staff assembled beside her on stage, and together creating a container. As you mail in your festival registrations, your energy flows into that container, and it's our job that no matter what happens, we hold that container with your energy inside so it can't dissipate. When you arrive, when the gates open, we unplug that container, giving back to you the beauty of your own collective energy. You re energize us with the gift of your excited energy. It is a magnificent, transformational exchange that cannot occur apart from the other. Well, any long term relationship has its ups and downs. I haven't been to a marriage counselor, but I have a feeling that maybe, at this moment, you might be having a relationship with someone else. I occasionally get that feeling. You're coming home a little late for dinner, you're a little thoughtless and distracted. I'm afraid you are beginning to view what we do here as an inexpensive vacation, and those who do the work here are economically disadvantaged. When the Jews in the 1950s had opportunities to assimilate, most of the Jewish Catskill Mountains culture was dismantled. It didn't take very long. One after another, the Jewish summer colonies that had sheltered and nourished it were gone. But the Jewish people have an ancient religion to hold them together. Likewise, many black people in the 1960s got their strength from groups in the southern churches. It sustained them during a time of enormous activism. Now, I ask you, what is going to sustain lesbian culture? Dead silence. Borders books? Lesbian culture is dissolving. We are all being pressured to join the consumer culture. Its hallmark, the bottom line, has become the only line. That makes it extremely difficult to take time and energy for your own life. Potluck groups don't meet. Nobody has time to cook. The small groups that used to meet in your neighborhood have dismantled. The women's bookstores are closing at an alarming rate. The lesbian newspapers are almost gone. The gay men's papers that I am able to find write little or nothing about the accomplishments, issues, or events. Our accomplishments, issues, or events. As our culture supports weaken and fail, as we become more isolated, we lose sight that it was us who had the originality, determination, and bravery to create it to begin with. It is us who must maintain it. If you do not make up your mind that you are going to have a motherland, this lesbian culture that we have painstakingly built together is going to be gone. No one in the future is even going to know that it existed, and it is going to be gone in a matter of a few more years. We are almost there. More than anything, I believe that Campfest is something of the heart. It's of the spirit. It is a dedication to the lesbian tribe. So I'm willing to go to marriage counseling. I hope you are too. And we both gotta give up the girlfriends. End quote. That was from 1999.